things had to get better in 1955, and for Le Mans, the brilliant young driver, Tony Brooks, was contracted. Much time had been wasted on the V12 Lagonda, the pet project of David Brown. At Le Mans, the car crashed and was out of the race at an early stage. We asked Tony Brooks how he came to drive for the Aston Martin team.
My association with Aston Martin started when I was invited for a test drive at Benson. It was a disused, I think, RAF airfield in Oxfordshire, and I was invited along together with I think 4 or 5 other hopefuls to have a test drive for Aston Martin under the careful supervision of John Wyer. But that seemed to go quite well, and I was then invited to join the Aston Martin team formally as a result of these tests, and so my first season with Aston Martin was in 1955, and I think my first partner was John Risley Pritchard. I can't remember which race it was, but I certainly remember we drove in the 1955 Le Mans, which was of course a fateful race, a very tragic event. And that was my start. But in 1955, I was only driving in the longer distance races because I already had an established team of, I think, Roy Salvadori, Peter Collins, Reg Parnell. So I was very much the new boy, and was only called in when they were running a full team in the longer distance races.
1955 was the year of the tragic accident at Le Mans when Pierre Levesque and some 80 spectators were killed. Levesque's Mercedes had hit the back of the Lance Macklin Austin Healey and disintegrated into the crowd. The accident alarmed Mercedes-Benz. Easily in the lead, they withdrew the 300 SLRs, but not before their newfangled air brakes had been tested.
We had the air brake, which of course was developed entirely and purely because we hadn't got disc brakes. We had very wide brakes, but they were inclined to bell, and they did have their own problems. And of course they did not give you the same deceleration. So we went to Le Mans with this air brake, which was a lever. You just flick the lever and the thing would go up. And it was like a big hand coming, incredible. And it would just hold the car back, and it was so good because certain corners like White House, I could go into that and just flick the thing up, come down from 150 to 120, whatever, I forget the speeds, and just go through without touching the foot brake. When you use the foot brake as well, obviously you had increased deceleration. I remember quite well that Jaguars tried to have them thrown out because they said that their drivers couldn't see past us when the wing came up, which was ridiculous because you don't look over the top anyway. But all Mercedes did then was cut a couple of windows in it. But I'll tell you how effective it was. Of course, when the brake went up, there was a bit of air disturbance, but then, of course, a lot more mechanical noise. And I remember going into the S's, flicking the brake up and slowing right up, and then going around the corner. I thought, my God, I've broken the engine. There was a terrible noise, and it just wouldn't go. So I looked in my rear view mirror and then realized I'd forgotten to put the air brake down. And of course, this was making the noise and the turbulence, and I thought I'd ruined the car. But it was that effective, even at relatively low speeds. I mean, 60 or 70, it was doing something. Fangio and I, it was the first time, the only time, in fact, we ever drove together, and which was great as far as I was concerned. And at the time of the terrible accident, Fangio was out there. And I was waiting because he was due in reasonably soon, and I was waiting on the pit counter. And there was this dreadful melee that happened. Obviously, one sort of thinks about it in hindsight, but it's not saying, I mean, I was just staying there, the car went past, and suddenly there was this enormous breaking up of the vehicle. And Fangio was not involved because of his quick reaction like that. I mean, he you know, was out of trouble and went on, and of course, came in. We did not expect to retire. We expected to continue racing, and the decision was made from Stuttgart because John Fitch, who was driving one of the cars, in fact he was driving the car that Pierre Levesque had the crash in, he said we ought to withdraw, and the people there said, well, there's no point, you know, why withdraw, because there'll be a tremendous chaos if we do, and so on and so forth. But anyway, he said, well, I think you should call up the directors back at Daimler-Benz, and this was done. And ultimately, they said, okay, you should pull out. But at that time, we had, I think, 20-minute lead over the Jaguar, which ultimately won. I mean, the SLR was without a doubt, the most superb sports car because it was so reliable. Everything was so good. Not easy to drive particularly because it was a big car, but everything did work well. And you know, one didn't think, you went into a 24-hour race and you didn't think, well, is this going to break or is that going to break? I mean, they were that reliable that you didn't consider it really.
Mercedes withdrew and Jaguar won. Hawthorn and Bueb giving the D-Type the first of 3 victories at Le Mans. Aston had entered 3 DB3Ss, for Collins and Frere, Salvadori Walker, and Brooks and John Risley Pritchard, plus the V12 Lagonda driven by Reg Parnell and Dennis Poor on this occasion. It retained the 4.5-litre V12 engine, but had a new chassis later to be used on the DBR2. The Salvadori Aston Martin retired with a broken crankshaft, while the Brooks car ran out of battery after the dynamo had failed. The Lagonda was no faster than the smaller Astons, and that too retired when in 9th place after 93 laps with fuel leakage. As dawn broke, Jaguars were in 1st and 2nd places, Rolt and Duncan Hamilton following the Hawthorn-Bueb car, while in 3rd place was the Works Maserati, and then Peter Collins and Paul Frere in 4th place with the sole remaining Aston. Rolt and Hamilton retired with the car jammed in gear, and the Maserati expired afterwards with transmission failure. This let Collins into 2nd place, a position he was to hold until the end of the race, and the Aston finished 39 miles behind the winning D-Type, which set a race record of 2.569 miles despite the Mercedes withdrawal. The Aston's distance would have been enough to win the race in 1954, and it was only 10 miles short of the previous record. In all, an encouraging result after 3 years of non-finishing. The rest of the season was spent in the UK, with a brilliant 1st, 2nd and 3rd at Aintree, led by Salvadori at the Grand Prix meeting, and he too finished 1st at Crystal Palace. Then came the Goodwood 9-hour race, and Aston's after their 3rd consecutive victory. Peter Walker and Dennis Poor won on this occasion, with Peter Collins and Tony Brooks delayed and finishing in 3rd place after leading easily. The other car retired. Reg Parnell could have kicked himself for letting in the clutch too suddenly at the start, a mistake which undoubtedly caused the rear axle failure. He made amends the following weekend, however. He borrowed a car and went off to win the Gold Cup at Oulton Park.
Peter Collins takes the car over from Tony Brooks and back into the race, 1 lap behind Titterington. The car, driven by Peter Walker and Dennis Poor, comes next to be refueled and have wheels quickly changed. A further 2 minutes to bind the gear lever knob which had come adrift, and 2 places further down the leaderboard.
The final outing of the year was the Tourist Trophy at Dundrod on that superb public road circuit in Northern Ireland. The race was a victory for Mercedes-Benz, but it was also a red letter day for Peter Collins. His DB3S had failed on the line. He was indeed last away from the start. The solenoid on the starter had packed up. In 30 laps of the Ulster lanes, he was in 3rd place, having passed some 40 cars. He'd overtaken Fangio on the Mercedes, he'd overtaken Hawthorn on the D-Type. And all this proved too much for the Aston's engine, which broke a conrod, and the brave Collins was out. Walker salvaged the team's honour by finishing in 4th place. Moss finished 1st, Fangio's second, Von Tripp's third, but it earned a Works Mercedes drive for Collins.